welcome in to a new edition of BWI Live. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickel. We are rocking and rolling T. Frank on a Wednesday. It's a big day in the Penn State football world. Roster update day. Yeah. The Nittany Lions getting their new heights and weights out there for the start of, or I guess the continuation of summer workouts before preseason camp. T. Frank, we got some news and notes to dive into on that front. A lot of weight changes as well. But first off, let's just start off with a very simple question. As we get ready for another show, are you ready to get into this? This is your favorite time of year. I know it.
I love, so this is the most complete roster because all of the freshman class is in, right? So we're locked and loaded for football season. And yeah, I love this stuff. I was the dude who played Madden but didn't play any of the games, just simulated and scouted and finding the guys that was 6'5", 295 pounds and ran a 4.4 because that stuff is fun. Numbers, data, information. Nerd out about it, which I'm excited to do with you today.
Yes, no doubt about it. Well, two news nuggets. First of all, I guess let's make it three. The entire class of 2024 is now here. Tysier Denmark and Kenny Wosley Jr., the two Philadelphia Imhotep commits in this class, are now officially both on campus, as we reported from Live for Life last week at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. Tysier Denmark, a very talented receiver, was here for that event, and now defensive back Kenny Wosley is here too. Denmark assigned number 4. Kenny Wosley assigned number 17. You can see the full class of 2024 number assignments at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. But T. Frank, before we get into the roster changes, Tysier Denmark is somebody we have talked about what feels like endlessly over the last couple weeks about him finally getting to campus. Yeah. Penn State lists him officially at 5'10", 177, which is pretty close to what he was, of course, coming out of high school. So he's here. He's ready to go, and we've talked about it a bit. But for the audience here today, just real quick, your thoughts on how realistic the hopes are from the fan base that he could factor into the receivers room this fall.
I would say it's about the same as Peter Gonzalez, obviously a little bit more because I think there's more positional skills to go there with being a little bigger. Like being close to 180 at 5'10 is pretty good for a guy who I think is just, it's fair to say, is an undersized wide receiver. So we talked about this, I think, a week or two ago when he was at the Big 33 game and he was playing outside. And you got to see that for the first time and see him kind of dominate those situations. I'm still always hesitant to say, like, yeah, absolutely, because I think I've been fairly consistent about the fact that I think the perception of him is a little greater than the potential impact he's going to make because of some of the things in his profile that are not necessarily ready to go. I think he can get faster at Penn State. I think he needs to do that. I think he needs to still get bigger still, but I'm more optimistic about his long-term projection as a standout receiver, having seen some of these things that he did recently. But it's an all-star game, so I'm still wait and see. I still think that there's a lot of really good stuff, but there's a long way to go before I'm saying he's leapfrogging somebody on the depth chart to then be a player for Penn State, especially in a crowded mid-tier wide receiver room, right? Which we're going to talk about later in the show in terms of getting the most out of that group.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Peter Gonzalez, as you mentioned, another class of 2024 signee who is now on campus. Head strength coach Chuck Losey recently very complimentary of the group that arrived somewhere between mid-May and early June. And, of course, these guys just getting here now in mid-June. But they're all in the midst, T. Frank, of their first summer workouts. And we're going to learn a lot about what those guys might be capable of in preseason camp based on how they adjust to the summer workouts, the player-led workouts, the time they get with the coaches that now includes a football, of course, thanks to the new NCAA rules. So they're not the only guys, of course, in the summer workout program. There's a lot of course, returning veterans who are trying to make moves, some who are trying to basically finesse themselves from a weight and conditioning perspective ahead of the season based on where they're at. But like we mentioned at the top of the show, the updated roster is here, T. Frank. We're going to start on the offense. Just initially, I guess, your thoughts on no one in particular. We'll get to that in a second. But as you looked at this list yesterday, what stood out to you about maybe the plan Chuck Losey and the strength staff have for some of these guys, specifically on offense, when it comes to changing their bodies between the end of spring practice and the start of preseason camp?
So the offensive line is always interesting because these are big dudes, so a large amount of weight sometimes doesn't even register. I mean, Anthony Donko's 336, and he kind of looks the same as he did before because he was 328. So certain players went up in weight, certain players went down in weight, and I find that particular part interesting because I'm just speculating here. This is like throw up a cautionary. I'm speculating about this. I don't have any inside information. I don't have any hard information. We're going to talk about Andy Kotelnicki's offense and some of the historical stuff I've looked at this week at the end of the show. But I'm talking here about some of these interior players, specifically Nick Dawkins. One of the few players that went down in weight, Nick Dawkins, down to 298. Some of this stuff is just natural fluctuations, but having seen him at Lift for Life, he is clearly trimmer than he was last year. And that goes into my open question about what does this team want from its center, from that player who's got to snap the ball and in a lot of these situations get to the second level in these zone concepts that Andy Kotelnicki is bringing. You want your guys to be like Anthony Donko, to be as big as possible and as fast as possible. But not every athlete has that ability, Greg. So if you have to choose between having a guy who's a little bit bigger and maybe it slows him down a little bit, but he holds up on the interior, or a guy that can run and get to the second level and be fit at that center position, I'm curious to see that. And because you see Alex Burkmeyer did the same thing. He's down to 299. Is that a signal he's going to play that center position as they try to find a home for him on the offensive line? Those are the two things I'm looking at from the offensive line in particular, where you've got two guys that went down in weight, but it matches things we've seen previously from Andy Kotelnicki's offense, where that center needs to be athletic and mobile, get to that Mike linebacker, that Will linebacker at the second level to open up these big run lanes for the running backs, because that is a huge part of this, is those explosive plays at the second level, athleticism and mobility. And so that's just kind of my curious speculation about this group to start. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at the offensive line changes, you make a good point with Dawkins. And then what jumped out to me, and let's just stay on the offensive line for a second, and I guess work our way through it from a seniority perspective. We'll go back to the freshman and then come back to Anthony Donko as one guy that jumped out to me as well. But when you look at the changes, Frank, of the freshman class, these guys clearly, in some cases, are building their body up. Egan Boyer from 251 to 273 is one example. And in the reverse direction, Garrett Sexton goes from 295 to 289, which, again, I think as you wrote about talking with Chuck Losey over before Lift for Life, rather, some of these guys come in and they need to break down a little bit to build back up, and other ones just need to start eating and start lifting, and their frame is in a good place, but they need to just start adding to it. So Egan Boyer is a great example of that, 251 to 273, so up 22.
And he's
for him.
The guy.
Yeah,
he's the guy where you didn't really even notice. Like he didn't look skinny anymore, but you wouldn't know that he's an offensive lineman walking around because now he looks like he fills out his own frame.
Right. Yeah, no doubt about it. And, when you talk about the freshman class, not to jump positions, but let's do that quick since we're on these guys. I think you and I both kind of had a pause moment and looked at each other when Luke Reynolds walked by shortly before Chuck Losey started talking. The tight end who was an early enrollee, so was able to get a jump on things in the weight room and on the field, up Frank from 228 to 241, and he looks it. I mean, it's not bad weight either. It's not he came in and spent 30 minutes a day at the creamery, right? He came in and really put on upper body weight to hopefully, in his mind, I'm sure, try and contribute this year. And if he was going to do that, we know what he is as a pass catcher, but the weight was going to be needed, and I'm sure still is to some degree, to block at this level. So really impressive gains for him. We'll get into the tight ends in just a sec, but I'm just curious, just from a freshman perspective, what you saw from just in general the class overall. Quentin Martin's another guy who made a pretty sizable jump 194 to 202, and I think that clearly those guys both have a chance to maybe contribute this fall, depending on how their preseason camp goes.
It's funny because you asked me that, and by the time you had the end of the sentence done, I had three more guys than I was expecting. Because, Luke Reynolds, in any other situation, we'd be talking about him as contributing somehow in this offense, and he still could, but there's just so many players in front of him. Those tight ends literally stand out from the crowd of other great athletes at Lift for Life, where you walk around, and the dudes that have the shoulders walking around like this, they're all tight ends. And it's amazing to see the transformation, because you add Luke Reynolds to that group, and now it's all of them. I would say two guys come to mind. Xavier Gilliam blows my mind from not just this past year, like since he got onto campus, but we saw him at Under Armour in Baltimore May of last year, and I think he was around 260. I don't have the exact... he was listed at 245. I think that's a little light according to Max Preps on the Quince Orchard roster. He was probably around 255, 260 then. He's 309. Is that what he is right now? I think on this list, the freshman list we have here, it's
306,
impressive. 306. Thank you. That's like a lifetime achievement award for the last 13 months of work where we were wondering, we talked about this on the recruiting show a year ago, is he going to try and play on the edge? Is he trying to keep his weight down? And then suddenly he shows up last year and he's defensive tackle size. And now, again, freshman defensive tackle, you always want to be careful, but he's got the size. And Chuck Losey specifically mentioned him when he was racking his brain about what early enrollees, what freshmen have stood out. It wasn't Quentin Martin he went to first. He went to Xavier Gilliam as an unprompted addition to the conversation. So that's really good. And then, Quentin Martin, I think, again, kind of like Egan Boyer, this is the natural progression where he needs to be just to fill out his frame. He's going to be a guy that's going to be 220, 225, and he's going to look lean at that size. And that's the advantage of when you got a big frame. As long as you can get his pad level down and keep it down, you don't have to pack on extra weight to have all of those things a part of your profile. So there have been a lot of these tall running backs that have come through Penn State recently, and they all have had different problems from tackle breaking and explosive plays. Haven't all worked out, but you look at what he's able to do and what we saw from him in the blue-white game, and I think you can't help but be excited about what he's going to be eventually at Penn State and in a position where he can contribute now, I think. Got you muted, Greg.
Let's change that then. Does the roster update here change your opinion at all in terms of how many freshmen could contribute this year? Or do you just see this as standard natural progression for guys that come from all different types of backgrounds? Some guys, of course, in this freshman class had more advanced training, be it at their high school or some outside entity. We heard Nick Singleton still praising garage strength 3 years after he left the Reading area to come to Penn State and work under Chuck Losey, but that set the foundation for the gains he made so quickly at Penn State. Other guys don't have necessarily the same training background, and they get here and they get the program and they get it, and the nutrition part of it kicks in, and they just shoot up the weight chart because of that. So does it change your opinion at all how this class could contribute, or is it about the same as it was before this update?
It's about opportunity more than it is about the weight changes, because that is the constant, right? It's who's ahead of you, who is going to be contributing and has that experience ahead of you. That being said, Peter Gonzalez, 6'2", 203, and Chuck Losey singled him out as a guy who he and his Central Catholic teammate, Anthony Specca, came in. He said, you wouldn't know these guys just got here by the way they lift and their level of preparedness. But that's not the problem with Peter Gonzalez. Peter Gonzalez has a massive hole in his projection to the next level because he didn't run any in-breaking routes when he was at Central Catholic. Right. And that's kind of an important thing when you're a wide receiver. He's got the work ethic to get it done, but does he have enough time? And that's really what we talk about with these players. I asked this of KJ Winston, because he loves football. He's into the details. He's into the X's and O's. And I asked him, how long is it? Just a time thing? How long does it take you to know football to the level you can play to your level of abilities? And he talked about how you've got to be in the film room all the time, and some of these things just take time. But on that note, Dejon Lane is the guy that I think we need to start talking about more. Even though one of the guys I do want to point out, in as far as that it got bigger this offseason, and I think have that blend now of size and understanding of the game, is Lamont Payne at that safety position. He's the guy that I'm looking at now as the fourth safety behind the starting three of Jalen Reed, Zakee Wheatley, and KJ Winston, because he flashed as a freshman corner. We knew he really wasn't going to stay there eventually just based on his body type and the fact that he hit like a Mack truck. Now he's 200 pounds, essentially, and he looks like a safety, and he's got the intelligence, he's got the aggressiveness. Has he completed that transition to that position from a mental standpoint? Dejon Lane just got here, but KJ Winston was raving about him as an athlete and a competitor. So those are the guys I guess I would say I'm keeping an eye on, but none of them really have a clear path to the field. This isn't like 2022 when Penn State needed Nick Singleton and Abdul Carter to come in and fill holes that were obvious on the roster.
Yeah, Anthony Poindexter speaking at Penn State's assistant coach media day last week, also complimentary of Dewan Lane as well. So we'll see how that all shakes out. T. Frank, moving on to a guy back on offense that does have a path to the field. Khalil Dinkins, your thought on the way he changed his body this offseason. It's weird. I wrote about this in our question series over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, but for the first time in a while, Penn State does not have a number 2 tight end going into the season that you're talking about in the same way as the number 1 tight end. I mean, last year, of course, it was Theo Johnson and Tyler Warren. Before that, it was Brenton Strange and Theo Johnson. There's been a few years now where that has obviously been the case. You have basically 1A and 1B. T. Frank, they don't have that necessarily at the moment this year, but Dinkins puts some more weight on as he looks to get the biggest role of his career here in 2024.
Yeah, it's a pretty simple equation. He needs to be able to block and catch at a level better than Andrew Rappelier, who, as much as I think we're all excited about to watch, whether you're a fan or you're an analyst like me and you're excited to see a guy who can be dynamic as a receiving threat. And the problem in this conversation is it always comes out binary, and I'm guilty of this, of Andrew Rappelier because he's 250 and he, again, walks around like a dude who's strapped from neck to ankle. But he's also a really good receiver. His technique and fundamentals at the position as a pure tight end from a receiving perspective were advanced coming into last year. And he's only had time to get better at that. And the question is, there were some clunky blocks during the blue-white game. Is he going to be that guy as a blocker to push Khalil Dinkins? And on the flip side, is Khalil Dinkins going to match the tenacity that we do know he has, that Andrew Rappelier has? And so that battle is going to push these guys to be more well-rounded. And I think from a receiving threat perspective, Khalil Dinkins is different. He runs like a wide receiver. That fluidity you just can't replicate even from a guy like Rappelier. But the role for either of these guys, there's a role where all three of them play. And I can see very clearly that you could have Andrew Rappelier as a backup to both tight end positions, and Khalil Dinkins is kind of your H-back, your move-back. I could see Rappelier being the H-back, and then Khalil Dinkins is kind of floating as a mobile chess piece. But it's Tyler Warren. He's going to be the star. And then how do these two fight for those roles in the offense? And run blocking is really important. And so whoever is able to do that better is going to be the receiving threat that's number 2 to Tyler Warren. I guess that's how I viewed it going into training camp. And at 253 now, he has the size, so he has to play up to that size now.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I see there's a comment on the YouTube channel about the embarrassment of riches at tight end. Then there's no doubt. I mean, Penn State's recruited that position extremely well. Ty Howe continues to not just get the guys in, but also develop them, which I think goes unnoticed, especially when, we go into draft season the last couple of years. And I think Brenton Strange and Theo Johnson both went higher than what most fans probably thought they would. And when they opted to skip the opportunity to come back for another season and instead go to the NFL. So I think that says a lot about Ty Howe, who's one of the more, to me, underrated recruiters and developers of talent on the staff. T. Frank, 2 more on offense, if you want to obviously take this any direction you want with some other guys. But before we get to the defense, let's focus at offensive tackle and a position battle that's going to be fascinating this preseason camp. There's no doubt about it. Anthony Donko up from 328 to 336. Nolan Rucci up from 305 to 317. Those are your competitors for the starting right tackle job, both putting on weight this offseason to try and win that job. And I think we're in agreement. Anthony Donko's the leader in the clubhouse there, but Penn State didn't bring Nolan Rucci in just to sit the bench, or at the very least, Nolan Rucci didn't come here just to sit the bench. He came here to compete for a first-team job. Whether he wins it or not is another matter, especially with what the experience Donko got specifically in the the Peach Bowl. But very interesting that those two guys continue to pack on the pounds as they get ready to compete for, a very key spot on this Penn State offense.
I can't believe I'm about to say this, but Anthony Donko is the more athletic of the two right now from an overall standpoint, which is crazy because Nolan Rucci was one of the most athletic offensive linemen I've seen, from high school in terms of being 6'8" almost and able to bend and be in an athletic stance at that size that was acceptable to block 5'11" defensive linemen in high school. And obviously there is a massive transition that goes on the offensive line that there are so many variables that you can't account for. But now he has all the tools, Greg, right? 317. Right. That's what he talked about where he wanted to get for playing weight. I'm sure if he stays at Penn State another year, that would be 320, based on his size. Because again, seeing him, he looks really fit. He looks really good. He looks like he could gain a little more weight and be kind of offensive lineman shaped, but at 317, he's big enough. The question then becomes, I think he was always a really good run blocker for an undersized offensive lineman. How much does this change his ability to create genuine momentum in the run game? And then the pass protection stuff is the number one thing for me, where I think Anthony Donko, from an athletic standpoint, has all the tools to be a great tackle. And the conversation we had the other day on the message board is, why isn't he a left tackle? I think it's a great question. Other than they already had guys they were planning to play at left tackle, and then they had a need at right tackle. So the younger guy steps in, does really well during the bowl game, and so you just leave it as it is. But I think that's a fair comparison to say that both of these guys had the athleticism to play on either side. Rucci played on the left side at Wisconsin. So it's going to be a real battle. And this is another situation where we've talked about a lack of depth, Greg, where you don't have players to push the starter or to create a true competition. We agree that Donko might be the leader, but if Rucci's providing that, chasing element to make everybody better, this only benefits Penn State and helps shore up an issue that I think all of us look at the offensive line, if we're being reasonable, and saying there's some big question marks there when it comes to level of play and a dip from last year, but where in that delta do they get to? Do they get close enough that it's acceptable to what they had last year with 2 top 70 offensive tackles on the offensive line?
Yeah, big shoes to fill for Penn State at offensive line. Of course, they're looking for improvement at receiver and across the board, quarterback, of course, as well. Along in Andy Kotelnicki's new offense, so we'll see how these changes affect that. Moving on to the defense, Steve Frank, let's flip to Tom Allen's side of the ball. Tom Allen, just real quick on the side, we got to talk to him at the coaches availability last week, and there are intense coaches on this staff, but I think Penn State fans, when they first get to see Tom Allen, who confirmed he is going to, as Manny Diaz and other Penn State coordinators, defensive coordinators in the James Franklin era did, call the game from the sideline. I think the first chance he gets to erupt over a positive play is going to surprise even the most aware Penn State fans of what he was like on the sideline at Indiana. This guy is intense, and he will let you know it physically and verbally. So get ready for that, Penn State fans. It's coming.
Do you remember a couple years ago when Penn State was good on offense and they were explosive and James Franklin would go nuts after a big touchdown? Now imagine they've got 2 of those guys on the sideline. If Penn State's good this year, it could look like a mosh pit on the sideline from the Penn State coaches. Like, there's a reality where that happens.
Yeah, and if your seats are underneath the Beaver Stadium coaches box, I think you're going to hear plenty of Andy Kotelnicki too. Something tells me Tom Allen said that he would not coach from the press box because he thinks he'd feel like a caged animal up there. And something tells me Andy Kotelnicki, even though he's always been up there, is probably a little bit passionate and not just very well reserved and quiet and calling the offense and all those things. So very fascinating to see how all that works out. But sticking with the defense, T. Frank, I guess let's start at everyone's favorite position at Penn State, and that's linebacker. 3 guys jumped out to you. Tony Rojas, obviously the second-year standout, goes from 225 all the way to 239 on this Penn State summer roster update. Dom DeLuca puts on 8 pounds to go up to 228. And Kari Jackson, the freshman, made the biggest jump of all, 226 to 246. Let's start with Rojas and work our way through that group.
Yeah, this to me signals that these guys are going to be playing in the box almost with no question, like with very little doubt. If they play a run-heavy team and do they need to move guys around? Yeah, okay. So we can have that conversation that Dom DeLuca can still play the Sam. Tony Rojas can still play the Sam. But Dom DeLuca was 218 last year on the official roster. And whether or not he gained weight over the season or whatever, we're going as these mile markers are intentional and they're what we have to work with. So being nearly 230, part of it is a natural progression of him playing linebacker for longer and building his body up, and you can't do it all in one offseason. But it's also, to me, an indication, he's playing will linebacker. Tony Rojas is playing will linebacker. There is absolutely no question about that. And Rojas being almost 240, gaining 40 pounds in the last 2 years, he looks like it. We've seen him at Penn State Prospect Camp. He's been out there hanging out with the other players that are around and help with the camps. He looks phenomenal. There are only so many ways that you can describe him and still have like a masculine tone about it, but it is impressive. Like, it's really impressive the way he looks and the way he's filled out. And he is going to be, I said this, I don't remember where I said this, but I think when it comes to pure linebacker, not just superstar at the position who then plays defensive end like Abdul Carter or Micah Parsons, he might be the best pure linebacker of this group in terms of his ability to play in coverage and his instincts to seek and destroy in the run game. We'll find out this year. But he gets glowing praise from his leadership to his physical transformation, and I loved what I saw from him last year. So I expect a breakout year from Tony Rojas because he's done everything right. Like, he is poised for that. And then Kari Jackson, it's just kind of a jaw dropper, Greg, where you look and you go, a guy that was a 3-star, we didn't really know too much about him because he got injured his senior season, and now he's almost 250. Like, he's heavier at 6'1" than Tamia Robinson is at almost 6'5". Is that all good weight? I don't know, but it is impressive to see that he gained 20 pounds since he enrolled at Penn State.
Yeah, there's no question about that. You like where Abdul Carter's at, up to 259?
Yeah, I think 265 has always been the number in my head for him of what he would look like in that Tony Rojas 2-year development curve of this is a guy who's going to be a pure athlete at the position and has all the tools. Because I don't think it's out of the question that he has the power to go along with the speed to be a complete edge rusher. Does it happen all in 1 year? Probably not. But he's now to a position at 260 where he can play the run and play the pass equally well as long as he plays from a tenacity standpoint up to the size. And that's the question with all these things is we know that these athletes are built the right way and they're going to have the explosiveness maximized in their frame based on the training. But do they then, with the way they play, go out and make it even better? Like fully maximize with their style of play. I still don't know Abdul Carter, the edge rusher, all that much because watching him in the blue-white game, he was content to run around people and not run through people. So we need to see a little more of that. He was used as a pure speed rusher and third down guy. So I want to see more from the way he plays. But the one that is more curious to me is Smith Vilbert. What do you make of him at this point?
It's hard to know what to make of him because I think there's been multiple seasons now, and of course health and injury is part of this as well, but he's listed at 292 now, up from 284, and it's been another year of offseason rather of wondering if this is finally the year he puts it all together and breaks out. I think he's a role player for this Penn State defensive line. I'm not sure that he's going to if he's going to rise to, the top 4 in terms of defensive end rotation, that would surprise me. I guess don't rule anything out. But, when you see that weight he's carrying now at 292, it does make you wonder a little bit what the plan is for him and where they see him fitting into Tom Allen's defense. Is he a guy that can play inside and out? We saw last year how Penn State did that with having, 3 down linemen and move some guys inside, things like that. To mess with defenses, obviously that was Manny Diaz, not Tom Allen. But I'm curious what that weight change means for him. Guy beside him, Frank Keziah Izzard is up to, if I can find the right screen here, 310, which is a good jump for him. The defensive tackle equation here is just fascinating. I mean, you have so many guys like Izzard, like Devon Ellies, like Hakeem Beamon, who are back for another season, and I think at times they don't get enough praise for what they've done at Penn State, but also I think there's been a lot of waiting and hoping that one of these guys would eventually, I don't know if it's fair to say blossom into a PJ Mustipher, but blossom into a bigger profile defensive tackle on maybe the Big Ten level. Maybe not nationally, but maybe the Big Ten level. And for a variety of reasons, health being in some cases a big part of it, just hasn't happened. And I think Ellies is a guy that played well last year and, probably does not, again, get as much praise as he should as he comes back for another season. But it does make you wonder, you look at this defensive tackle group, it has enough numbers. Does it have enough Big Ten championship caliber players? And I think Izzard making that weight jump is good, but it's not. She doesn't, in my mind, doesn't change. I think the defensive tackle ceiling is high. I just have questions about whether it can reach it.
So this is an interesting one. I'm gonna kind of take you in the Wayback Machine with Keziah Izzard because this is what I saw from him at DeMatha when he was a prospect. He was a big-bodied defensive end. He was everything you wanted in a classic 3 technique. He has the proper length. I think he's got like a 33-inch reach. He's now 310 pounds, and he moves really well. Penn State has not had a complete defensive tackle. And Greg, this is a kind of the point I would make to support what you're saying is they haven't had a guy that can do everything. They've had some undersized guys. Hakeem Beamon has flashed a little bit. Zane Durant can be great. He can be elite, but he's still 6'1", 285, 290 pounds. He's not 310 and a guy that the NFL would be interested in. And that's really what we're talking about, I think, is the growth potential for this group, literally and figuratively, has always had kind of a ceiling. And the players that have had the ability and the potential haven't reached the max of it to kind of break through that. Izzard has taken longer than I think any of us have expected, especially at maybe the Penn State staff more than me, but this is what he was supposed to be the whole time. This is the player that I think they envisioned him to be when they recruited him. And now, again, like we said about all these other players, he's got to go out and play like it, but he now has all the tools to be a complete 3 technique if I'm projecting to the next level, or a guy that can play either position. And Penn State can have the flexibility to play left, right, and not have to designate a nose tackle and a 3 technique. They have the size and the ability to potentially dominate in situations and get pressure from the interior. That's another thing they just haven't been able to do is get consistent pressure from those defensive tackles. And Izzard, now you expect a growth from Durant. They've got the weapons up front to go from a good group, I think as you described them, solid last year, that answered all the questions. There's some difference-making potential now, and I think that's the biggest thing with Izzard and what you would hope you get out of Zane Durant and that natural progression.
It's time to roll into the second half of this edition of BWI Live. Before we get there, if you're watching, please hit that like button and also subscribe. T. Frank, if you want more T. Frank, more from Nate, Ryan, Sean, myself over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, join us now. You're never going to get a better deal than the one we're about to flash on the screen for you, just here on the YouTube channel or on the podcast. It's 2 months for $1. You need the promo code, which I will get here in just a second, but if you want inside info on recruiting, team news, roster updates, the latest on official visitors, we're soon going to be into Lash Bass season. The preseason camp is right around the corner. All those things and more. Join us, BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. T. Frank, do you have the promo code handy? There it is. Code PSU1. It's a special offer just for you guys here listening to BWI Live. And, of course, the BWI Live replay as well. $1 for 2 months at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. Use code PSU1. That's PSU1 at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com for $1 deal for 2 months of access to our premium content that you can't find anywhere else. So we hope you join us there, subscribe there, and please subscribe and like us here on the YouTube channel. T. Frank, I know it's mailbag time. We have one planned mailbag question, but I want to get to this one in the chat from Josh Bazin quick. And Josh, I hope I pronounced your last name right. But he asked, how much is DC Allen going to employ a 4-3 versus his preferred 4-2-5 with the linebacker depth? I mean, I'll let you get into this more specifically from a formation standpoint, but to me, I think that we've spent a lot of time talking about that this offseason, and there's a good reason for it.
Yeah, it's matchup dependent, so it's not. This is always interesting because I asked Tom Allen about this, and he said we base out of a 4-3. We're a 3-down linebacker defense. We like to play the line. We think it provides flexibility and opportunity. And then you look at his defenses, and they're all 4-2-5s. They all run that style. So I think there's a philosophical conversation that the coach will have and debate with you that I love. That the reality it doesn't matter. So it's easier, in my opinion. From a tactical perspective, it's easier to face run teams if you've already got guys like Abdul Carter and Tony Rojas on the roster. It's as much a numbers game as it is a tactical one. And it's really hard to run the football. So if you got guys that can blow up their block, it's hard to run the football. You can also overwhelm with numbers, which is the idea of the 4-2-5, having safeties that you can move around, overload and predict where the ball is going to go, and then get tackles for loss or win with athleticism. So they have the ability to do both on the roster, but the linebacker depth is less than it has been in the past. They've also invested time and energy into this lion position. They're going to play it. So all things being equal, you're going to see more 4-2-5 than you're going to see any of these other positions. Now, last year, against teams like Penn State and Ohio State and Michigan, Indiana went into kind of a hybrid defense where they had essentially what Abdul Carter's position would do, which is float between the Sam linebacker and an edge rusher. Penn State doesn't need to do that because they've got the talent to have those guys just zone drop and run blitz and have them line up at defensive end and then drop. And all of those subtleties in coverage and the subtleties in alignment don't matter as much if you got 4 guys that can line up and control the line of scrimmage. Going back to Smith-Vilbert, Nittany did a sentence 272. I think they can play with 4 down linemen and control the game because, again, we're talking about other players on the roster. Amin Vanover played defensive tackle at one point on this team, so they've got a big edge group. I think that's going to dictate a lot of these things, which allows you to then dip more heavily into your 4-2-5 and take advantage of the ability to play the run with maybe fewer players and then play coverage and get to a suffocating level of defense. So to me, absolutely Jalen Reed, 4-2-5. And when it's not Jalen Reed, they're going to be playing nickel defenders, corners playing that slot. It's going to be a lot more athleticism on the field. That's my prediction based on what we've seen here from this group.
Yeah, and Tom Allen speaking about the line position, saying last week it's an important spot for us, and it's a big part of the new Big Ten. The bottom line is that the position gives us more flexibility to do some things that you need to do in today's game. Context of that quote, talking about Wisconsin and the way that offense has changed and the way it is not your, Bears Wisconsin offense, that's for sure. And so I think that is what, when you talk about 4-2-5 in that line position, you're right, it's matchup dependent, it's team dependent, but a lot of teams are certainly playing an offensive style, including Penn State, that lends itself to more 4-2-5 than 4-3, especially when you have the linebacker situation that Penn State does. TJ, let's get into our planned mailbag question, and I'm going to paraphrase this, and if you feel like you need to add some more context before we get into it,
please do.
Pop up on the screen for those of you listening. But basically, the question today is, can Penn State's receivers room actually be better, even if the stats aren't better than they were a year ago? That's a rough way of phrasing this, but essentially the question is this: could a successful rebound for the wide receivers look like 3 receivers catching closer to 40 passes, but significantly more production from the running backs and tight ends in the passing game, and also a drop rate that is half of what it was in 2023? Keep in mind, part of that drop rate was Tyler Warren in the tight end position. But, I think that the whole idea here is, can more, and this is the title of today's show episode, of course, but can more, happen even with less production for the receivers? And what would that look like if that is the case?
So Townsend Nitt hit a bit of a nerve here, Greg, because, and this is, I'm going to do my best to not get too deep into my feelings, but I have literally been writing about this all offseason. This is, you look at the film, and we're going to go through some of this. And by the way, you're getting the good stuff today. I'm squeezing the juice out of the orange. You're going to get some premium content on the show. Now, some of it is from months ago, but I just want everyone to be aware of that's the point of this offense. That's the point of Andy Kotelnicki, and that's going to get into what we talk about with the Stag Bowl once we get through this particular topic about specifically the wide receivers. There's 2 ways we can look at this. I wrote about the players that can stand to benefit the most from Andy Kotelnicki's offense back, I think, in February or March. And the receivers, specifically the slot receiver, because Luke Grimm was very good for them last year, but generally he's been very good about dialing up big plays for those receivers. The yards per catch and all of these numbers are so much higher in the Kansas offense than they were in the Penn State offense a year ago. And let's just get into some of these numbers that are meaningful to this particular conversation. We're going to start with some big picture, and then we'll get to some nuanced things in yards per route run. So this is the total targets that receivers saw from these 2 teams last year. 376 targets for Penn State, 295 for Kansas. So Penn State threw the ball significantly more, despite being a run team, by the way. Just the way they put together these long slogging drives, they had more plays. But if you look at the number of explosive plays, despite throwing the ball significantly fewer times, Kansas had 20 more explosive passing plays than Penn State. That shows up all over the stats. Yards per reception, average depth of target, yards per route run, all of these efficiency metrics that Townsend Nitt is talking about. It's not just the drops, it's not just the throwaways, not just the dead plays in the offense. It's generating those explosive plays, but designing the offense to have a strong run element, be led in certain situations by that, but being able to generate these explosive plays, even when I would say the Kansas offense did not feature an elite passer and good receivers, maybe underrated receivers, but receivers that Penn State should definitely have more talent than, not only from the top 3, but the depth of the room based on recruiting and their ability to just bring talent in, Greg. So this is the game. Townsend Nitt hit on it exactly. This is going to be an efficient, explosive passing attack that uses all of the things we've talked about with Andy Kotelnicki in my film rooms and over when we've been dissecting this stuff, these run-pass blending opportunities to generate explosive plays. That's it. That's the point of this offense.
Yeah, and it's why Andy Kotelnicki was brought in. James Franklin talked a lot at his recent news conference last week. You can find that video if you missed it here on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel. If you're on the podcast, check us out, bluewhiteillustrated.com on YouTube. But, James Franklin talked about, he made it very clear to point out that he feels like they're back to having more of a mix of all the different things that each coordinator before Andy Kotelnicki did, but they're doing it in a more focused way, I think, is probably the takeaway there. And also, I thought it was interesting that he went out of his way to point out that there's a focus now on making sure they're, A, emphasizing what each player does best, and then B, getting the best players the ball. And that was not always the case last year for whatever reason. I think it's easy to blame Mike Yurcich. I'm not sure that was all totally on him, but there's no question that I think it's fair to wonder if he took advantage enough of Penn State's tight ends last year, especially considering the receiver situation. But we have been down that road a million times, so we don't need to go down it again.
I have more data on that one. I have so much more data we could talk about with that. I think Drew Aller's a part of that, and the confidence instilled in him by Andy Kotelnicki and James Franklin this offseason has to take root. Because explosive plays over the middle of the tight ends, that was Theo Johnson's bag. There were multiple times he was running down the seam where there was an opportunity, not wide open, but an opportunity, and the ball went other places. So, not to cut you off, that's absolutely 100% correct, Greg. You hit that one on the head.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the idea here behind the thesis is that Penn State does not look. I saw someone in the comment earlier, and I don't disagree, which is basically, I'll paraphrase, saying that you need NFL receivers to have an NFL caliber receiver room, and I totally get that, and I don't disagree. But I don't think it's crazy to sit here and say that if you would have a upper middle tier receivers room this year, I'm not saying top 10, but top 20. Top 25, maybe it's a little bit on the fringe, maybe a little bit too far down, but I don't think you need the nation's #1 receivers room to get where Penn State wants to go and make a 12-team playoff. Top 15, top 20, I think you can do that. And I don't think, again, the statistics may only put them in the top 20, the back half of the top 20. We may sit here and say, well, that's not very good. But to the efficiency point of all this, if you're doing things in a way that, A, gets the running game going, and you have a very productive running game, and you just need the passing game at times to set that up and utilize some other things in this Andy Kotelnicki offense, and I don't think it's the end of the world. And there's a part of me that says I'm setting the bar too low, because I just don't know what to expect with this receivers room anymore. Yeah. And there's a part of me that truly believes that, Penn State just needs some, obviously, big production inconsistency, or big increase in consistency, rather. But also the ability to use the passing game when they need to, and then when they don't need to, and then they want to. And that was not obviously the case a year ago.
So I'm going to get into that here. One quick diversion. Ryan Sheard, I put this up earlier. He says, 71 people watching this, 18 likes. We can do better. We can absolutely do better. Appreciate you, Ryan. Please like the video. Helps everyone know that this conversation doesn't suck. I always say we're all battling the almighty algorithm on the internet, so I always appreciate that. He does ask this. He says, how are Big Ten defenses different than what Andy Kotelnicki went against through his time, and that will limit explosive plays versus his history? So, what's the difference between the Big Ten and the Big 12? And that's the thing. I'm gonna touch on part of this right now, but really it goes back to he's gotten explosive plays everywhere. So that's a history you can't ignore, that it's not just one stop. It's not just against Big 12 defenses, which safeties in the Big 12 think that coverage is optional, and I don't understand how that's possible. But that's kind of the reality. Some of these things that you do to break the defense won't break the defense against an Iowa or a Michigan or an Ohio State that have talented players that don't make big mistakes. But here is talking about the players you have on the roster, Greg, to your point about, do they need to just be an average wide receiver room? Yards per route run. This is a bit of an obscure stat, but what it describes is your efficiency. How many routes you run and the empty calories in those routes. So your total yardage, essentially divided by the number of routes you run. And if you can't see this, I apologize. I was having some difficulties. Usually my graphics are better than this, but I'm going to put this up again. If you notice, all three of the leading receivers for Kansas are ahead of Penn State's receivers. 2.51, that's a good number. That's a healthy number in average of yards per route run. 3 and above is elite. 2 and below is a problem. All of Penn State's receivers last year have 2 and below. All of Kansas's receivers are 2 and above. Keandre Lambert-Smith is an NFL talent. Like, from a talent perspective, easy answer. Can run every route, explosive, fast, all that stuff from a talent perspective. Trey Wallace is an NFL receiver from a talent perspective. He doesn't have to run a 4.3 with a composite amount of skills from a physical perspective to play in the NFL with no question. Right. Getting the efficiency out of those guys is health, mentality, and opportunity. They can solve the opportunity one, and they're working on the other two. Health, we'll see. But they have the opportunity now to be more explosive and to get better results with the same talent. So yes, they can absolutely get more blood from this stone. Andy Kotelnicki's talked about it. Marcus Hagen's talked about it, that this group has been a bit of a punching bag. And I think that when you look at kind of the totality of the offense, you force-fed Keandre Lambert-Smith 100 and some targets or 85 targets, whatever it was, the majority of the targets. Having a more cohesive plan to get more players involved with more opportunity is absolutely the plan for this offense going forward.
Yeah, and I think that's where the talk about Quentin Martin fits into this conversation. Is he a guy that Penn State can get some use out of in the receiving game despite being a running back? How can the running backs be better utilized in the receiving game? We heard, Katron Allen flash maybe the biggest smile we've seen earlier this winter before spring. It was during spring practice, I believe, but just talking about how they can be utilized in this offense in ways that he hasn't been at Penn State, specifically as a receiver. Him and Nick obviously have plenty of experience as pass catchers. Can they be a part of what solves the receiver issue? Because let's just boil it down to this. The numbers you just talked about kind of say it all. And what all of it is to me is that, yeah, the receiver room needs to be better, but if you have guys on the roster who can help mitigate some of the weaknesses they may have as a collective group, you need to use them. And I'm not sure Penn State did enough of that last year. So what can Andy Kotelnicki do to augment what the receivers room can do? I'm not saying you're going to put, Quentin Martin, Luke Reynolds, Andrew Rapplier out there on the field at the same time and split them 3 wide and see what happens. But what can Penn State do to, build on the strength of its receivers? Another thing James Franklin talked about last week was the return of Harrison Trey Wallace and how important he feels like he is to this offense this year. You can't disagree with that. You can certainly question whether he'll be healthy enough for a whole season to be the big part of that offense that we think he can be. I mean, again, the Peach Bowl is kind of the perfect example, right? Where he showed some flashes and then got a little bit dinged up and, wasn't available for some of that game. And that's kind of been the story of his career so far. Immense potential, questionable availability. So we'll see if this is the year he can finally stay healthy and on the field. Because if he can, he has every reason to possibly end up in the conversation of being among the Big Ten's best receivers by the end of the year. The talent's there. Is the availability there? And then, of course, is the play from the quarterback and the offense at large there for him to be there? But I think that's what, we've talked a lot about it already, T. Frank, and we're going to spend at least another 2 months talking about it, 2 months and change, because, the numbers you put up there sort of illustrate the whole idea of this Penn State, outlook on offense. And that's, you knew what last year was. There, you can find some good numbers on the offense in general. You may be able to find some good ones related to receivers, but there's a lot of hope in what Andy Kotelnicki can do to improve them. But there's also a lot of people, and I'm in the same group, that just want to see it to believe it. And all you can hear and see and whatever, all the things you want during summer workouts, during preseason camp. Let's see what it looks like at West Virginia. And I know everyone was probably, there's probably at least one comment saying, well, we should have more of an opinion before you get to West Virginia. And that's fine. But my opinion is just at this point, seeing is believing. I need to see it happen. Yeah. And I need to, be able to put actual stock in the fact that what is being said in terms of improvement is actually being put onto the field in reality. Yeah.
And that's where you don't know. I can give you exactly what's happened at all these different stops with Andy Kotelnicki's offense, what he's going to try and do, and it still has to work. Like, there's always that translation to Ryan's question about the Big Ten and playing a better level of competition, but we've seen it replicated so many different times. There is you gave me enough time to find this. Another premium article I wrote about 3 positions that are going to stand to benefit from Andy Kotelnicki's offense. And we talk about the running backs. We don't talk about them as receivers. So again, we're talking about a metric of average depth of target. How valuable are your receptions? Last year, Penn State threw the ball underneath over and over and over and over again. So the passing attack, as we've seen, was incredibly inefficient. So the running backs in Penn State's offense last year, average depth of target was 0 yards down the field. They got the ball at the line of scrimmage. So you say run after the catch in those situations gets you 4 or 5 yards is roughly what a running back gets. So the value of that target is 4 yards. That's a run play, a good run play, but that's a run play. Average receptions are like 7 to 9. So Andy Kotelnicki comes in, and his average depth of target is extremely far down the field for a running back. He aggressively uses these guys. You talk about Quentin Martin, talk about a move piece, Katron Allen, Nick Singleton. These guys have receiving opportunities and abilities and can threaten the defense down the field. So if you start 4 yards down the field with your average depth of target, meaning that there are wheel routes going 17 yards down the field, and then you add in those 5 yards, now you're near a first down for a running back, which is so much more valuable than catching a swing pass and maybe getting yards, but also maybe getting tackled for no gain because you threw into a zone and it was a check down. Not every single pass has to be a check down to the running back. Andy Kotelnicki does a better job of getting those athletes in space as running backs. Quentin Martin's going to be a running back. He might line up in the slot, but his position is running back. And that's an important distinction. These guys can be used more effectively. And then, Tyler Warren. Feature him in the offense, get explosive plays down the seam, open up the defense like a can, split them both ways, run your important player down the middle of the field. Andy Kotelnicki is great at isolating players down the field and getting matchup advantages. Those are all great parts of the conversation there. And that leads us kind of into the last thing, which I want to talk about. I went in the Wayback Machine, Greg, and I looked at the Wisconsin Whitewater offense from 2013 when he joined Lance Leipold for the first time, and then they developed their then decade-long relationship as offensive coordinator and head coach, where he followed him from Wisconsin Whitewater to Buffalo, then to Kansas. I found some really interesting stuff that I wanted to go over here to get out of the show, because I think it also talks to, it doesn't have to be just like it was at Kansas. There are other flavors of this offense under Andy Kotelnicki.
Yeah, there are. And I think that when you look at kind of his career progression, the things you have outlined here, so I'm just going to read them off for everybody, and then you can break them down as you go. But tempo, pass to set up the run. There's obviously a QB. We've heard about it all offseason. You're going to hear more about it. The QB must be able to run, has to be effective in the run game. Doesn't have to be the greatest runner ever at the quarterback position. No Michael Vick is required rather.
Yeah.
Easy for me to say, to run this offense. And then obviously getting the best player of the football, which is something we talked about earlier. So as you look back through his career, how those things evolved at each stop he's made, obviously a different level of football at almost every place he's been in terms of, he's pretty much been on a career arc, T. Frank, of each stop is a new level of competition compared to where he was before.
I think that it's important to go back to this particular situation for the personnel involved. So Matt Barrent, I think is his name. There's a random D in the middle of it, so I hope I pronounced that correctly. He's the quarterback of an offense from Andy Kotelnicki in 2013 that threw 35 touchdowns and 1 interception. Does that sound like anybody, Greg, that we've seen from Penn State recently? Right. Somebody who's smart with the football?
I think I know that name. Know that name.
Yeah, so you have a direct correlation to Drew Aller. And also, from a traits perspective, they didn't run any read option in this game. Now, I didn't go through the whole season and look and see if they ran read option in other games, but this is a guy who's athletic, but they didn't lean on the way they did at Kansas, where they had pure read option. The quarterback is pulling the ball and running for 20 yards on these big explosive play sets where he's kind of a focal point of the run game. They put the ball in the hands of their running back at the time. I'm trying to get these names so that I sound official and smart. So I apologize for a little bit of umming and ahhing here, but he ran the ball in this game 28 times. The thing that I think is important about this is we go back to getting the ball in your best player's hands. Jake Kumerow was on this team. He is a Green Bay Packer, Buffalo Bill, a journeyman NFL wide receiver who is a cult hero at any team that he goes to because he's a good football player. 6'5", not super fast, but he was dominant in this game. He got 7 targets for 103 yards. Jordan Ratliff looks like the hero, but Tyler Huber, their slot receiver, 2 touchdowns, averaged 16 yards per reception. So again, these are the numbers we saw at Kansas. These are the numbers we see at Wisconsin Whitewater. Getting the ball, setting up the run with the pass as opposed to setting up the pass with the run like he did at Kansas. You want to find examples of different skill sets and different abilities to then feature in this offense. Here's an example. They threw the ball to a guy who was uncoverable, and then that backed off the defense so that Jordan Ratliff was running into 5-man boxes. They end up shredding that team for 146 yards from their lead running back. Now, Barrett did have 56 yards rushing. He did have some quarterback keepers. So that is a part of the offense. Aller has to be able to run the football, but it doesn't have to be service academy running. It doesn't have to be triple option. It doesn't have to be read option. The usage of the RPO, the different things that we see from, and if you want to get the full breakdown, I'm not going through all of the things that I saw in this game. I did a full watch along on the message board, so you can go and see all of those details, including stills and different terrible drawings. But to me, the biggest thing was they didn't have to use the read option to create an explosive run game. That sets up well that they have both options in this offense, and they can blend in special packages with Bo Pribula, and they can have a standard offense that doesn't have to lean on those things with Drew Aller. Gives them so many more opportunities, and you have the confidence of he's done it before. I don't care if it's at Wisconsin Whitewater. He dominated this D3 level at this game in the championship game. So that gives you some of the confidence we're talking about of this can translate to the Big Ten as long as the players stay healthy and everything goes how you would want it to from a luck perspective and from the players are learning the offense and ready to go and all that stuff.
Yeah, there's no question. I think if Andy Kotelnicki has shown anything over his career, it's the ability to almost, I think back to like when Mike Yurcich got here, and the big question was, would he be able to maximize Penn State's best players? And that conversation obviously was focused a lot on the tight end because he did not have experience career-wise of using that position in a way that maximized it or featured it, which of course with Penn State having such talent there, that was a big question. I think Andy Kotelnicki has shown that no matter what position he needs to feature, he will. And so I think if you're a Penn State fan, you should feel good about that. T. Frank, it's closing time here on this edition of the BWI Live. Any final thoughts as we get ready to wrap this edition up? Big recruiting weekend on deck for Penn State. There was a wrestling question in the chat about where former Iowa wrestler AJ Ferrari will end up. I have no idea. I'll be completely honest with you. It could be anywhere. Anything is possible. We do have a wrestling show coming out later this week. That was not covered, but stay tuned for more on Penn State wrestling then. But your final thoughts, T. Frank, as we wrap up another BWI Live. It's mid-June, buddy. It's going to be mid-August, and we're going to be right in the thick of preseason camp before we know it. Yeah.
You nailed it. Recruiting. I mean, the Tuesday show has turned into a recruiting show, basically, where we go with the mailbag is chocked full of recruiting questions. And, I'm looking at film. I'm going to start looking at film for Jameer Joseph and taking a look at some of the players that commit over the next couple of weeks. So that's me. But generally, BlueWhiteIllustrated.com is your place to go to get the information about the who, the what, the where, the when, and I'll give you the why later. But, great stuff from everybody. And I guess the main thing about the second half of this show is just, man, we're talking about this stuff, We've been doing this for 3 or 4 months at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. Come join us, and then we'll all be on the same page. We'll all have the same conversation, and we'll go into the year as prepared as possible. I think the next thing I want to do is I want to start scouting opponents, like taking a look at USC, taking a look at some of those teams that Penn State's going to face this year, what they do, why they do it, how they do it, and then get you prepared for that later in the year so you're not going into the USC game completely blind. This is a new team. You'll have an idea of what to expect from those guys as well.
Well, to get on the same page with us at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, join us. The promo code, we'll give it to you one more time. It's $1 for 2 months of access just for you guys here with us on BWI Live or the BWI Live replay. It's PSU1, code PSU1 at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com for $1. Where it gets you 2 months of access for just $1. So join us there. Please make sure you like and subscribe wherever you're listening, either on YouTube or the podcast feeds. Thanks for being with us. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickel from Blue White Illustrated. Back Thursday with the guys in the recruiting show, and we'll have plenty for you as another official visit weekend gets ready to kick off. Have a great day, everyone.